Erik Larson, The Demon of Unrest, a saga of hubris, heartbreak, and heroism at the dawn of the Civil War. Dive into the gripping prelude to the American Civil War with Erik Larson's The Demon of Unrest, a saga of hubris, heartbreak, and heroism at the dawn of the Civil War. As tensions mounted across the United States in 1860, the nation stood on the brink of a civil conflict ignited by the contentious issue of slavery. This book unravels the fractured political landscape, spotlighting how divergent parties and towering figures like Abraham Lincoln navigated these tumultuous times. Explore the fervent push for secession in the South, the complex interplay of political ideologies, and the precarious defense of federal forts that set the stage for war. Through vivid storytelling, Larson paints a poignant picture of a nation grappling with its identity, torn between preserving a way of life and forging a new path toward unity and equality.
Precarious Prelude. As Abraham Lincoln approached the 1860 election, the nation stood on the brink of chaos over the contentious issue of slavery. The Democratic Party, previously a dominant force, splintered into Northern and Southern factions, each putting forward their presidential candidate. Meanwhile, the Constitutional Union Party attempted to heal the widening rift between North and South. At the forefront, the Republican Party, with a firm stance against slavery's expansion, emerged as a formidable contender, rallying behind Lincoln. For the Southern states, Lincoln's potential election represented more than just a political change, it was perceived as an existential threat. The radical pro-slavery advocates, the fire eaters, and the wealthy Southern chivalry saw their way of life imperiled by the anti-slavery Republicans. Despite Lincoln's assurances that he would not interfere with slavery where it already existed, distrust ran deep, fueled by Southern media secession calls if Lincoln won. On November 6, 1860, Lincoln's victory was secured by key states like New York, despite receiving less than half the popular vote due to the divided field. He dominated the Electoral College but found little support in the South, where his presence was negligible, even in his birthplace, Kentucky. As Lincoln awaited inauguration, Southern calls for secession grew louder, amplifying tensions. In Charleston, South Carolina, Colonel John Gardner, leading U.S. Army forces, feared a takeover of strategic forts, particularly Fort Sumter in the harbor. Concerned about the threat posed by potential militias and mobs, he sought more troops for protection. Yet, within Washington, doubts about his capability led to his replacement by Major Robert Anderson. With roots in the South but a fierce loyalty to the Union, Anderson stepped into a volatile situation at Charleston Harbor, where pressures were only set to escalate. Antebellum Echoes. In the heart of Charleston, a city buzzing with economic activity, the grim reality of the domestic slave trade thrived, with regular auctions tearing families apart. Slavery wasn't confined to sprawling plantations, it was woven into the very fabric of the city, sustaining the day-to-day opulence of the Southern elite. Here, the enslaved outnumbered the free, seamlessly integrating into every facet of life, underscoring the South's heavy reliance on this oppressive system. The thought of Abraham Lincoln assuming the presidency struck fear deep within the hearts of Southern figures like James Hammond. A man whose wealth and influence were deeply rooted in slavery, Hammond viewed this institution as the cornerstone of Southern civilization. But by the mid-19th century, defending slavery became increasingly challenging. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin rocked the nation in 1852, captivating the North while provoking intense ire in the South. Hammond and his contemporaries struggled to fathom the growing Northern opposition, staunch in their conviction that their society, built on enslaved labor, was noble and justified. By 1857, Hammond had maneuvered his way into the U.S. Senate, powered by fiery orations like his infamous Mudsill speech. In it, he posited that slavery represented society's natural order, with superior races entitled to exploit those deemed inferior for the greater good. His words resonated with Southern leaders, bolstering his political ascent. In step with Hammond stood Edmund Ruffin, a staunch defender of Southern valor against Northern radical abolitionists. Unlike many alarmed by John Brown's audacious 1859 raid on Harper's Ferry, Ruffin was invigorated, seeing it as a catalyst for Southern independence. He warned his fellow Southerners that unless they seceded, emancipation would lead to racial equality, a dreaded scenario where blacks might obtain the same rights as whites, potentially even leading to interracial marriage, or amalgamation, a prospect Southerners feared deeply. Though Lincoln did not advocate for racial parity, such anxieties were deeply embedded in Southern society, fervently stoked by influential voices like Ruffin and Hammond. Their rhetoric fueled secessionist fervor, framing the growing conflict as an existential struggle for Southern life and identity. Unity under siege. In the fervent climate of Charleston, the drive towards secession intensified after Abraham Lincoln's election. Figures like Augustus Longstreet viewed it as an inevitable, powerful tide, while voices such as Mary Chestnut feared the advent of war under Lincoln's leadership. Her husband, U.S. Senator James Chestnut, exited his role to join the secessionists, reflecting widespread Southern anxiety. Northern reactions to Lincoln were varied, with doubts about his capacity to navigate the nation through mounting tensions. During this pivotal moment, outgoing President Buchanan's lack of decisive action frustrated parties across the political spectrum. His inability to safeguard federal assets like Charleston's forts, while failing Southern interests, sowed further unrest. As Southern states broke away, tensions flared, notably when South Carolina severed ties on December 24, 1860. This act intensified scrutiny around the vulnerable forts. Stationed at Fort Moultrie within Charleston Harbor, Major Robert Anderson perceived the fort's indefensibility. Despite his warnings to Washington, President Buchanan feared provoking conflict by reinforcing it. Taking matters into his own hands, Anderson organized a covert relocation of his troops to Fort Sumter, a stronger position at the harbor's center. Under the cover of Christmas cheer on December 26, 1860, he completed the move, dismantling what ammunition he left behind and disabling Moultrie's cannons. By morning, Charleston found itself confronted by Anderson's strategic shift. The North praised Anderson's daring move, but Charleston's Governor Francis Pickens reacted with resolve to capture remaining federal strongholds. Pickens cut off supplies to Fort Sumter and orchestrated military preparations nearby. In the midst of the regional uproar, Buchanan, caught unaware, found faint solace in the support from General Winfield Scott, who endorsed Anderson's decision and sought reinforcements despite logistical setbacks. In a bid to bolster Fort Sumter discreetly, the North dispatched the commercial steamer Star of the West with reinforcements on January 8, 1861. However, Southern vigilance prevailed as warning shots forced a retreat. Anderson's restraint averted escalation, yet the incident underscored the widening readiness gap between North and South. Each remained on edge, with Fort Sumter at the crux of a conflict poised to erupt, symbolizing the broader national crisis as both sides prepared for an inevitable confrontation. The tipping point. Major Anderson tread carefully as tensions mounted, wary of sparking a full-scale war. Yet, within his ranks, figures like Captain Abner Doubleday believed conflict was inevitable, viewing Anderson's cautiousness as detrimental to the U.S. Army's image. In the shadow of Fort Sumter, their urgency grew. With each passing day, their provisions dwindled, while opposition forces only grew stronger, frustrating Doubleday further. Meanwhile, the Southern states were resolute. By late January, 6 states, including Louisiana, had seceded. In Charleston Harbor, enslaved laborers were coerced into strengthening the Southern artillery around Fort Sumter. Anderson's small force of 75 men faced an overwhelming 2,000 South Carolina soldiers. Simultaneously, the Confederate States of America began taking shape. As Abraham Lincoln embarked on his journey to Washington for his inauguration, he reassured the nation of his intent to stand firm, asserting the Union's right to protect its properties, like Fort Sumter, without aggression. Yet, Lincoln's resolve seemed untouched by the increasing Southern defiance. His Secretary of State, William H. Seward, mistakenly believed passive waiting would quell the rebellion. It was a dangerous underestimation. Lincoln's dilemma. On March 4, 1861, Lincoln's inaugural address stirred a mix of emotions, leaving some inspired and others apprehensive about America's future. His carefully crafted words posed the question, would there be peace or war? For many in the South, the message pointed toward inevitable conflict, and with General Beauregard's arrival in Charleston, anticipation of war intensified, particularly around Fort Sumter. Among the first communications President Lincoln received was a report from Major Anderson at Fort Sumter, outlining a desperate situation as their supplies dwindled. General Winfield Scott assessed the dire straits and recommended surrender. Yet, Lincoln couldn't shake off the notion that conceding Sumter would embolden the Confederacy and demoralize the Union. In facing these challenging choices, Gustavus Vasa Fox proposed a daring plan. This ambitious former Navy midshipman believed in his ability to break through the blockade to deliver crucial supplies and reinforcements to Fort Sumter. Lincoln, intrigued by this audacious idea, dispatched Fox to Charleston to evaluate the practicality of his plan. Upon Fox's arrival on March 22, he engaged in a terse meeting with Major Anderson, who expressed skepticism, warning that they could not hold beyond April 15 without intervention. Fox, however, left with renewed confidence, ready to implement his resupply strategy. The situation was further complicated by a similar crisis at Fort Pickens in Florida, pressing Lincoln into a decision. On March 28, General Scott presented Lincoln with a stark choice: evacuate or dramatically strengthen both forts. This sobering counsel spurred Lincoln into decisive action. By early April, he authorized a mission to resupply Fort Sumter and reinforce Fort Pickens, though the path ahead promised significant challenges. The missteps at Sumter. On an April day in 1861, President Lincoln found himself grappling with a significant blunder, unintentionally assigning the warship Powhatan to two simultaneous missions, Fort Sumter and Fort Pickens. By the time the oversight was identified, the Powhatan was already en route to Fort Pickens. Attempts to redirect the ship proved futile as Lieutenant David Dixon Porter disregarded the recall order, having not received it directly from Lincoln. Oblivious to this miscommunication, Captain Fox plowed ahead through a tumultuous storm, delaying his mission further. By April 8, word of the resupply effort reached Charleston, prompting the Confederates to prepare for an inevitable conflict. In a final bid to avert violence, the Confederacy asked Major Robert Anderson to surrender on April 11. His refusal set the stage for the battle that erupted at dawn on April 12, when Edmund Ruffin had the grim honor of firing the first shot at Fort Sumter. Amidst the bombardment, Major Anderson and his men maintained composure, making do with a meager breakfast and only returning fire once daylight broke. Though Sumter's fortified walls stood firm against the onslaught, its more vulnerable upper levels housed its most potent weaponry, rendering them useless under fire. Meanwhile, Captain Fox encountered his own challenges as he approached Charleston Harbor. Missing crucial ships, including the Powhatan, and contending with low tides and turbulent waters, his strategy dissipated. Early on April 13, disaster struck Fort Sumter when a cannonball ruptured the unfinished upper structure, igniting a fire that menaced the fort's precious gunpowder supply. Bereft of resources, Major Anderson succumbed to the inevitable, accepting the evacuation terms laid out by Beauregard. These included a ceremonial cannon salute to the Union flag. In a stroke of irony, the only casualty of the battle, Private Hoff, perished during this very salute, casting a shadow over the conclusion of hostilities. As Major Anderson and his troops vacated Fort Sumter, the scene was one of mutual honor. Passing Morris Island, they witnessed Confederate soldiers offering silent respect, hats removed in a solemn salute to their adversaries. This poignant gesture marked the end of a pivotal, albeit tragic, chapter in the unfolding saga of the Civil War. Echoes of Fort Sumter. Charleston was jubilant following the capture of Fort Sumter, a moment perceived by many as a triumph. However, to Sir William Howard Russell, a prominent London Times journalist, there was an undercurrent of foreboding. He noticed how isolated Northern politicians were, oblivious to the South's perspectives before the brewing storm erupted. Russell, having observed both sides, recognized that the Confederate strike at Fort Sumter signified a dark turn. On April 15, 1861, just a day after the fort's evacuation, President Lincoln called for 75,000 troops. His aim was to quell the rebellion and restore federal authority in the seceded states. But instead of calming tensions, his proposal further fueled the fire. Virginia seceded 2 days later, with Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee soon joining. In North Carolina, fervent secessionist excitement was described as a moral epidemic overtaking the population. Despite the border states, Maryland, Missouri, Kentucky, and Delaware, staying with the Union, their support for Lincoln's mobilization was tepid at best. As war loomed, Russell saw the Union's restoration slipping away. Edmund Ruffin, an ardent proponent of the war, confidently sent his sons to fight, expecting a swift victory. But as 4 harrowing years passed, with 750,000 lives sacrificed and slavery abolished, it was the Union that stood victorious. On April 14, 1865, Fort Sumter bore witness to a different celebration. Robert Anderson, once surrendered, raised the American flag there again. That same evening, at a Charleston hotel, emotional tributes flowed, including one honoring Abraham Lincoln. Unbeknownst to the attendees, Lincoln was breathing his last, felled by an assassin at Ford's Theater. The close of the war signified not only a rejoiced Union but also highlighted lingering issues the country had yet to resolve.
Ultimately, The Demon of Unrest chronicles a critical juncture in American history where ideals clashed, and a nation was born of fire and strife. Capturing the essence of both the heroes and the deeply entrenched societal norms of the time, Larson's narrative provides profound insights into the hubris and heartbreak that both divided and defined the United States. From Major Anderson's strategic moves at Fort Sumter to Abraham Lincoln's steadfast resolve to preserve the Union, the book distills the essence of courage and conviction amidst unparalleled challenges. As American society continues to navigate the echoes of its past, this saga serves as a powerful reminder of the complexities and sacrifices inherent in the quest for justice and unity.